The tribunal of Virx 9 was held in a chamber so vast it defied gravity. Stars flickered through the translucent ceilings, and gravity rings hummed beneath the floor, levitating the attending dignitaries in silent orbits. There were no chairs, only equilibrium. Among the ascendant races, stillness was a sign of enlightenment, movement implied need, emotion implied failure, grief, most of all, was criminal. On this day an amendment to the Lex Sentialis passed without objection: no conscious being shall mourn the dead beyond their expiration. The Kyrox floated their spiral symbiote shells in unison. The Voth aligned their ink veins to neutral tones. The venerable Taish closed their 6 eyes in contemplative assent. The decree was etched into the neural archives of 10,000 worlds. 1,000 light-years away, Earth burned. The Battle of Io's wake had left the Pacific coast fractured and blackened, cities drowned beneath silicate floods from orbital kinetic strikes. The alien fleet that launched them had been nameless, functioning by probability currents, incapable of speech, purpose, or remorse. Their objective had never been deciphered. They simply arrived, mutilated, and vanished, drawn elsewhere by metrics humans couldn't perceive. In the aftermath, 100 million humans died. Their absence stained the psyche of Earth like blood on a white sheet. But humanity did not outlaw grief, they cultivated it. In the ruins of Sacramento, a woman named Arden Vance found her daughter's voice recorder buried beneath ash and twisted synthcrete. She played it every night before sleep, the rasp of a 4-year-old reciting constellations by name. She refused to erase it. Arden joined the Remembrance Corps a month later, just after the rains fell acidic and stripped the outer bark of the memory trees. The Remembrance Corps were not soldiers in the beginning. They were mourners. They archived names, recovered personal artifacts from war zones, and mapped mass grave coordinates from planetary scans. They were mocked by the Interstellar Accord. Grief was weakness, they claimed. To catalog sorrow was to wallow in disorder. But something dark and bright coiled in humanity then. The Corps grew, expanded, formalized. Their motto was unspoken, written only on the inner casing of their armor: we carry the dead where others bury them. 10 years after Io's wake, humanity joined the Spiral Conclave as a provisional species. Their ships were crude. Their command hierarchy was confused. They had no homeworld capital. Earth was still recovering. But they spoke with weight. Every ambassador wore Remembrance black. Their translators carried a background hum, almost like static, but anyone who listened closely would hear layered voices speaking in Earth tongues. The dead had become the chorus. At first, the Conclave tolerated them. The humans were a curiosity, strange and inward-focused. But when the Arcgal Crusade swept across the mid-spiral, extinguishing colonies without diplomacy or cause, it was the humans who stood alone at Riadis Verge. And it was there that grief became a weapon. Captain Niles Arcav of the frigate Ash in orbit stood on the bridge as 3 Arcgal dreadforms approached. Their mass signatures bent starlight. No other species would face them, only humans. Niles opened the comlink and did not speak. Instead, he uploaded a single file, a sequence of visual memories. Images of lost children, crushed cities, corpses cradled in makeshift shrines made of scavenged satellite dishes and torn flags. The Arcgal did not pause. They had no reaction. They were machines or something close to it. The Ash in orbit fired every torpedo it had, then rammed the lead dreadform at 32% light speed. It died with its archives open, still broadcasting memories. From its shattered wreckage, something new was born. The first griefcasters emerged from the wreckage analysis, pulse bombs encoded with the neural grief maps of fallen populations. Not weapons in the traditional sense, these had no heat, no plasma yield. Instead, they disrupted enemy consensus fields. In species where thought was communal or collective, grief disintegrated unity. Isolation followed, then collapse. The Conclave protested. They called it psychological terrorism. The humans called it balance. Not every race fell to grief casting. The Voth, whose minds were independent and mirrored, resisted its effects. The Taish developed grief-nullifying feedback matrices. The Kyrox denounced the method but secretly harvested neural imprint data from human battlefields. But a new front had opened. Not of territory, but of memory. The Remembrance Corps now wore armor laced with neural mesh. In battle, their presence broadcast mourning into the surrounding electromagnetic fields, blanketing enemy sensors with the echo of loss. Enemies found themselves disoriented. Their strategic projections eroded. Some surrendered simply to make the grief stop. Yet to humanity, these were not tactics, they were truths. On the edge of the Balthorn Drift, Remembrance Officer Arden Vance led a small team into the aftermath of the Rithil bombardment. The Rithil were void shapers, cold logic tacticians. They left no survivors. The human team walked through the ash of 500 million burned minds. They did not speak for 2 hours. Then Arden took a single preserved thought fragment from a collapsed memory tower, wrapped it in cryo-shielding, and knelt. "We will not let them go unremembered," she said. The others did not echo her. They simply stood, their visors glowing with sorrow-laced resonance, and began to scan for what could be salvaged. A toy, a drawing, a biometric echo. They were not just recovering data. They were building a weapon. In conclave halls, debates raged. Humanity was becoming myth. Some called them grief-mongers, others prophets of remembrance. One delegate from the Catholic observance phrased it thus: "They wear sorrow like a second skin and cut deeper with memory than others do with steel." But humanity was not listening. They were building something vast. It began with the mourning shipyards over Ganymede Prime, massive orbital dry docks that sang with the encoded names of the lost. Every new vessel constructed was named for a city fallen, a child unavenged, a moment stolen. Each hull bore the inscription, "Your absence is our fire." And from that fire, new warforms were forged. Not in anger, in mourning. A mourning that could kill. Across the stars, alien empires grew wary. This was not evolution, this was divergence. No species had ever transmuted grief into systemized strength. To the Conclave, grief was personal, disposable, weak. But to humanity, it was structural. By the time the first mourning dreadnought deployed, the silence broken, its resonance field crippled 2 orbital fleets without firing a shot. Because within its core, billions of voices whispered their farewells in every human language. It did not plead. It did not scream. It remembered. And in that remembrance, it struck. The silence broken drifted beyond the wreckage fields of Calavar's fall, its resonance field pulsing like a second heartbeat across the void. The ships of the Krith Ascendancy spun uselessly around it, their neural pilots weeping inside their cockpits without understanding why. They were not wired for grief, had never known what it was to mourn, and so when humanity unleashed its blade, they crumbled. Admiral K.O. Mendez stood at the viewing cradle of the dreadnought, arms clasped behind his back, watching the last Krith cruisers lose all coherence. He did not issue an order to fire. There was no need. The Krith fled, their formations dissolving into scattershot desperation. At his side, First Officer Tara Shin whispered, "How many do we add to the chorus, sir?" K.O.'s jaw tensed, all of them. The Remembrance archivists would take their echo signatures. Not to honor them, not yet. The Krith had chosen to erase their enemies without thought. Humanity would answer by preserving their fall. Every death, even enemy deaths, became a thread in the great mourning tapestry stretching from Earth's broken cradle into the farthest arms of the galaxy. Each addition strengthened the blade. Not everyone on Earth agreed with the path. Debates flared in the rebuilt cities. How much could be weaponized before it consumed them? Were they preserving dignity or wielding vengeance disguised as sanctity? But those debates were drowned by the tides of war. The Rithil, furious at humanity's survival, unleashed a second invasion wave aimed at Sol itself. 6 carrier fleets, shielded against kinetic strikes and radiation fields, bore down across the heliocentric outskirts. The defense grid of Earth, half-finished, barely operational, flickered under the load. In orbit above Mars, Arden Vance, now promoted to Remembrance General, gathered a coalition of the living and the lost. No other race would help. The Taish offered condolences, the Voth dispatched non-interference envoys, the Kyrox debated sanctions, none lifted a claw or a ship to Earth's defense. They had already accepted humanity's extinction as inevitable. But humanity had not. The mourning fleet mobilized. 10 dreadnoughts, each an anthem of remembrance made flesh, formed a wall between Earth and annihilation. As the Rithil approached, they unleashed not fire or plasma, but a different payload entirely. Grief bombs. Spheres launched into the Rithil formation detonated with no light, no heat. Instead, they released concentrated fields of structured sorrow, harmonized to resonate against the Rithil's collective cognition threads. The result was catastrophic. The Rithil armadas stumbled. Their fleets broke apart mid-formation. Some vessels turned and collided with their own escort wings. Others simply went dark, their crews incapacitated by floods of loss they had never been taught to endure. Above it all, the silence broken broadcast a memory, not Earth, but the Rithil's own forgotten colonies, the ones they had abandoned centuries ago during internal purges. Humanity had unearthed their sins and turned them into weapons. By the time the counteroffensive surged, only fragments of the Rithil fleets remained. The mourning fleet moved in grim precision, dismembering the survivors without malice. There was no triumph in the slaughter, only necessity. Victory was not celebrated. It was recorded. Every mourning vessel archived the aftermath. Every casualty, friend, enemy, civilian, was etched into the growing symphony of the dead. In the ruins of the Martian defensive ring, Arden Vance walked alone among the shattered debris fields. Her armor, blacker than the void behind her, shimmered with residual resonance. She paused by a twisted Rithil command node, its organic processors leaking viscous blue fluid. She knelt and placed her hand against it, feeling the faint pulse of a dying mind inside, not mercy, not hatred. Recognition. Even their enemies were worthy of being remembered. Back on Earth, at the memorial halls of Alexandria Spire, a new archive chamber was sanctified. For the first time, humanity opened its remembrance codex to alien voices. It was a controversial decision. Many feared corruption, dilution of purpose, but Arden insisted. "The dead are not ours alone," she said before the newly assembled Terran conclave. "Grief is the one truth the galaxy forgot. We will remind them." From that decision, something vast and uncharted began to bloom. Other species, curious and desperate, sent emissaries to Earth, not to conquer, not to lecture, but to understand. Delegations from minor races, the Jurassic, the Alth, the insectal Feroc, came bearing their own small griefs, tentative offerings placed at the foot of Earth's great remembrance spire. The humans accepted them all. They taught others to shape their mourning into strength. They showed them how to forge new resonance fields, how to wield sorrow not as burden but as blade. Outcasts, exiles, broken peoples found new purpose under Earth's strange banner. A coalition of the fallen began to form, clandestine at first, then overt. And humanity, once alone, began to gather an army not of vengeance but of memory. Meanwhile, the elder powers of the Spiral Conclave grew restless. The Voth deployed diplomatic fleets to observe and disrupt the spread of human methods. The Kyrox passed decrees forbidding memory weaponization in their protectorates. The Taish retreated into their crystalline enclaves, severing trade lines to Earth. To them, humanity was a contagion, an anomaly, a fracture in the cold perfection they had built across millennia. And so, behind gilded council doors, they plotted. Not for open war, that would only feed the human fire. Instead, they sought erasure. Sanctions, isolation, the quiet suffocation of a dangerous idea. But humanity had learned to survive absence before. They had become artisans of loss, architects of persistence. When trade routes closed, they engineered self-sufficient bioships grown from terraformed ruins. When diplomatic channels severed, they communicated through remembrance beacons encoded into the background radiation of abandoned sectors. Each blockade became a crucible. Each abandonment became a hymn. The coalition of the fallen grew. Within 3 decades, the core conclave worlds found themselves surrounded by systems that no longer recognized their authority, not conquered, not converted. Remembered. Whispers spread through the dark currents between stars. Humanity was no longer just a species, they were a movement. A resonance. A weapon made of memory. And somewhere in the shattered cores of forgotten empires, ancient powers stirred. Old codes, older than the conclave, awoke. Protocols meant to extinguish anomalies before they consumed the spiral. Humanity had cut the silence once. Now the silence prepared to cut back. But Earth no longer stood alone. Grief had shaped them, and grief would shield them. For in every lost voice, every fallen ally, every burned world, humanity carried a blade that could never again be sheathed. The signal that ended the long standoff was not a fleet nor a declaration. It was a sound. A threnody, ancient and pure, encoded in waveforms so old they predated speech. A song meant for endings. It flooded through the void like blood through fractured veins, reaching Earth's outposts, the mourning fleets, the hidden remembrance stations scattered among dead moons. The Spiral Conclave, through intermediaries and ancient proxies, had activated the protocols of final silence. Not a war, an obliteration. The protocols were seated at the birth of the conclave, embedded in the roots of every major power's infrastructure, forgotten until needed. They were never designed to be used on species. They were designed to erase aberrations, phenomena too dangerous to conventional order. Humanity had become such a phenomenon. From the icy rimworlds of Bother's Reach to the shattered belts of Ylva's Maw, conclave sleeper devices awoke, gravity wells reversed, stars folded into blind spheres, data lattices spanning centuries crumbled, the galaxy shivered under a systemic pulse of erasure. Whole systems went dark overnight. The coalition of the fallen staggered, their communications crumbled, their fleets lost cohesion, outposts reliant on delicate life support vanished into dust. On a dozen worlds, entire populations flickered out as if they had never existed. On Earth, the remembrance spire shook. The great resonance choirs fell silent, cut off from their sister stations. The mourning dreadnoughts lost synchronization. For the first time in half a century, the endless, layered hum of humanity's grief faltered. Panic did not spread. Something harder did. Resolve. Arden Vance, now High Remembrancer of Humanity, stood atop the cracked glass of the Alexandria Spire's summit, wind tearing at her resonance cloak, and issued one order through the ancient backup frequencies that could not be erased. Remember harder. Across Earth's scattered forces, resonance cores flared, griefcasters burned brighter, the dead sang louder, humanity's sorrow became defiant. Where the conclave sought to erase, humanity etched deeper. In the heart of the moon's core bunkers, archivists activated Project Harrow, a forbidden weapon, whispered of but never dared. They would not only remember the dead. They would rebuild them. In the black vaults of Europa's ice citadels, neural matrices fused into artificial graveyards, not clones, not puppets, echoes made flesh woven of pure grief, of encoded remembrance. The first Echo Knights emerged, warriors stitched together from the lives lost at Io's wake, the fall of New Nagoya, the drowning of Lagos Prime. Each knight carried a shard of the past, armored in the collective will of humanity's sorrow. Their eyes burned with remembrance. Their weapons sang with the voices of the lost. They did not bleed. They wept. And as the final silence tore through star systems like a blade, the Echo Knights rode the resonance currents, counterattacking not with fleets but with living memory. On distant forgotten planets where conclave stations had activated annihilation protocols, the Echo Knights arrived. They did not destroy. They rekindled. Every dead world they touched blossomed into a resonant node, broadcasting loss, pain, love, survival. Not signals to be decoded but fields to be felt. Grief weaponized to fracture the mechanisms of erasure. The conclave's instruments faltered. Where annihilation struck, humanity countered with memory so overwhelming, so unrelenting, that the destruction fields collapsed under paradoxical weight. Stars that had folded into silence burned anew. Data that had been nullified regrew along newly formed pathways of human design. The protocols were not built to resist remembrance. The spiral conclave panicked. The elder races convened a midnight council, an act reserved only for extinction-level threats. They spoke not in open assembly but behind cloaks of null thought, hiding even from their own allies. There the Taish proposed a final solution, not to erase humanity's memory, but to sever them entirely from the fabric of causality. A memory that could not be accessed could not resist. They would collapse humanity into an echo chamber, a sealed pocket of spacetime, forever isolated, forever grieving. A tomb. The vote passed. The weapon they needed, though ancient, still existed, the scission engine locked deep within the forbidden vaults of Kyrox Prime. They would need time to awaken it. But Earth would not wait. Humanity had seen the signs. Through the resonance choirs, through the rising psychic echoes bleeding into even the most barren stars, they knew. High Remembrancer Arden gathered the mourning fleet at Lagrange Null, the dead center between Sol and its broken child, Mars. All banners lowered. All signal lights dimmed. And there they sang. Not in words. Not in battle cries. They released the totality of their loss into a single, galaxy-spanning resonance. A call to the forgotten. Across the spiral arms, those who had lost everything heard it. The Feroc queens who had buried 10,000 clutches under conquered soil rose and cast off their conclave yokes. The shattered clans of Jurassic, long broken and enslaved, turned their mining ships into weapons. The lost remnants of the Alth emerged from cryograves deep within rogue planets, answering the resonance. And even older beings, ancient remnants from before the conclave's founding, stirred from their long dormancy, drawn by the gravitational wound humanity had torn open with sorrow. A new force gathered in the darkness. Not an army of empires. An army of grief. A coalition not merely of humans, but of every being that had lost and been silenced and refused to forget. They called it the mourning tide. It would not negotiate. It would not surrender. It would remember, and in that remembrance reshape the galaxy. The conclave's time was ending. The silence they had worshipped was cracking. And through the fractures humanity marched, blade in hand, carrying the dead on their backs, voices rising louder with every step. The final silence had failed. The final war had begun. The morning tide rose like a dark sun on the rim of the spiral conclave's oldest strongholds. It did not announce itself with parades or declarations. It arrived in fields of resonant pressure, in systems whose stars dimmed under the psychic weight of collected sorrow. Worlds once loyal to the conclave found their citizens collapsing in the streets, overcome by sudden inherited griefs not their own. Factions that had ruled for millennia by sterilizing emotion now faced it weaponized and alive. At the head of the tide, humanity sailed ancient scars turned into engines of war. The silence, broken, repaired, and reforged, led the charge alongside new vessels whose names stitched together a history of devastation. The ashes of Lagos, the cradle of Rheatus, the children of Io, each hull gleamed with remembrance etchings visible even from orbit. The Scission engine, still dormant beneath Chirox Prime, loomed as the last hope of the conclave. They poured every remaining resource into awakening it. Vast convoys transported thought matter fuel across war-torn systems. Hollowed-out moons became containment chambers for the inevitable reality collapse the engine would unleash. Their plan was not precision. It was annihilation. Humanity would be severed from memory, folded into a silent dimension where grief could never reach again. In the chaos of gathering storms, High Remembrancer Arden Vance called the first morning conclave on the ruins of Old Val's Marineris. Not just humans attended. The Feroc queens arrived in living barges of bone and light. The Jurasi clans, wearing armor made of fallen kin. The Alth, silent and spectral, moving like reflections in water. Even the ancient Sindor Vesari, whose name had not been spoken since the First Era, sent their living archivists. Their ships bled starlight and regret in equal measure. Beneath the dust-red sky of Mars, they formed a pact. No written treaty. No signed accord. Only a single shared act. Each representative offered a memory, the most painful, the most precious, encoded into a shard of matter, then fused together into the morning keystone. It would become their covenant. Their sword. And their shield. The plan that emerged was desperate. The morning tide would not merely assault Chirox Prime. They would cut deeper. The Scission engine's protocols were tied to ancient memory structures rooted beneath the conclave's very founding world, Uvith. If humanity could reach Uvith's core reliquary and seed it with the morning keystone, they could reverse the engine's effect. Instead of sealing humanity away, it would shatter the conclave's ability to enforce silence forever. The conclave's core races, sensing the shift, moved with sudden violence. The Voth unleashed the Mindshear fleets, vessels designed to burn neural pathways with focused resonance inversions. The Chirox broke every treaty they had ever signed, activating extinction protocols across subordinate species without mercy. The Taish, in a final act of self-righteous horror, detonated the null mirrors, vast constructs that turned entire sectors into dead zones where thought could not propagate. The galaxy fell into a maelstrom of betrayal, destruction, and rising grief. And from that storm, humanity found strength. Arden Vance personally led the Spear of Remembrance fleet toward Uvith, riding at the prow of the Silence Broken. Her armor, now ancient and scorched from 1,000 battles, bore the fingerprints of every friend she had lost. Her presence hummed with layered resonance, not burdened by grief but armored in it. The journey was a trial through darkness. At the eviscerated gate, Voth assassins ambushed the Spear fleet, using thought-erase weapons that turned officers into hollow shells. Arden's forces answered not with retaliation but with deep-cast memory bombs, reviving the dead echoes of slain humans to confuse and blind their attackers. At the broken Sea of Luthen, the Chirox attempted to drown the fleet in synthetically induced apathy, muting all emotions to paralyzing stillness. But the mourning choir aboard the flagship Ashes of Lagos unleashed a counterwave of raw ancestral sorrow, snapping the human crews awake with tears and rage and clarity. At the final approach to Yuvith, the Taish released their Silence Weavers, entities of null space designed to unmake ships at the quantum level. The Echo Knights met them blade for blade. The battle did not look like fire or missiles. It looked like memories clashing against oblivion. Each Echo Knight carried a core memory too vast for unmaking. Some bore the last laughter of lost cities. Others carried the agony of betrayed worlds. Their weapons burned with moments never forgotten, and when they struck the Silence Weavers, the null space beings shrieked and folded into dust, unable to withstand the weight of unyielding grief. And yet the Scission engine stirred. At Kyrox Prime, beneath black oceans older than any living star, the final countdown began. If it completed, humanity's entire timeline would be severed, their memory dispersed like smoke before wind. On Yuvith's surface, Arden and her vanguard fought through corridors of glass and thought metal. The core reliquary loomed at the center, a sphere of crystallized time, pulsing with a heartbeat that was not alive. Thousands of conclave defenders stood between them and the heart. Arden raised the mourning keystone high. No orders. No speeches. The tide surged forward. The battle at Yuvith's core was a collision not of armies but of wills. Conclave forces fought with desperation, trying to preserve their ancient, ordered universe. Humanity and the Coalition fought with the fury of the forgotten, wielding every lost life, every stolen future, every unwept tear as a blade. In the final push, as Arden reached the core, she was struck. A mind lance from a Taish ascendant punched through her side, cracking armor, slicing flesh. She staggered, but in her hand the keystone remained. The memories of Earth, of the Coalition, of the billions who had been silenced, sang through her veins. And she threw it. The mourning keystone struck the core reliquary. The structure absorbed it, trembled, then split. Not with sound, with memory. Across the galaxy, the Scission engine recoiled. Its energy, meant to fold humanity into silence, reversed. Instead, it unfolded every silenced grief across every silenced race the Conclave had ever crushed. Forgotten civilizations, erased from history, burst back into existence. Extinct languages whispered through starfields. Lost souls reformed as starlight songs. The very fabric of the spiral shook as remembrance flooded into every wound the Conclave had ever inflicted. The Elder Powers screamed in horror. The galaxy did not return to order. It awoke, and humanity stood at its heart, bleeding, unbroken, blade in hand, carried not by power, not by conquest, but by the unstoppable tide of remembered loss. The war was not yet over. But the Conclave's silence had been irrevocably shattered. The spiral galaxy bled light from 1,000 fresh wounds. Star systems once ruled by certainty now hummed with uncertainty, mourning, and remembrance. The spiral conclave, ageless in tradition, unyielding in structure, had been broken, not by superior weapons or technological dominance, but by the unbearable gravity of grief made manifest. Humanity had not won a war. They had rewritten the nature of conflict. The Scission engine lay dormant, its vault split wide and gutted, no longer a tool of suppression but a monument to failure. The very act of weaponizing silence had backfired so profoundly that entire philosophies collapsed with it. The Voth retreated into their mind arcs, sealing themselves away from galactic contact. The Taish fragmented into regional sects, each interpreting the failure as a holy rupture. The Kyrox suffered rebellion in their outer systems, as their younger generations questioned the cost of perpetual control. But chaos was not peace, and humanity understood this better than anyone. The mourning tide did not disband, it evolved. Arden Vance, half reconstructed in the aftermath of Yuvith, was no longer simply High Remembrancer. She had become a myth carried in pulse code and deep void whispers, the bearer of the dead, the knife that cut the silence. And even as she healed bone fusions, nervous reconstruction, a new resonance lattice embedded along her spine, she set the course for what came next. A future where memory would not only protect but govern. In the great void between arms of the galaxy, in a system long abandoned and charted only by ghosts, the Coalition of the Fallen established the Archivum Magna. A station the size of a moon. Its surface bore no guns, no shields, no monuments. Only names, etched into iron, obsidian, stardust, neural fiber. Each corridor, each chamber, each span of silence within the archivum carried a weight. The grief of the galaxy, accumulated, honored, and shared. Delegates from the resurrected peoples of forgotten planets arrived in waves, not to pledge allegiance to Earth but to contribute, to be seen, and to see others. Because when memory became collective, sorrow became armor. Beneath the archive, a new resonance network grew, not just human, not just military, but galactic, a living web of shared mourning, woven from the fall of empires and the last breath of children alike. It connected survivors not by hierarchy but by understanding. The galaxy itself was learning to grieve. And from grief to act. Not all accepted the new order. Fragments of the old conclave declared secession, refusing to join any structure that did not enforce detachment. They called themselves the Purifiers. They attacked resonance nodes, believing emotion to be contagion. They bombed planets where the archive had begun to seed its signal. But their strikes were not met with counterattacks. They were met with memorials. On every world they targeted, the mourning tide returned, not with fleets but with remembrance convoys. Survivors, refugees, and even former enemies gathered in the open and grieved together. They carried no banners, they brought no weapons, but they brought stories, images, names, songs, pain. The Purifiers found themselves destabilized. Because for all their strength, they had never learned to endure memory. And memory did not break. It grew. The Echo Knights evolved too. No longer solely guardians of memory, they became translators of sorrow, interpreters between species whose grief expressed differently. They walked through the ruins of forgotten wars and unearthed the bones of language. They taught the Feroc to cry aloud. They taught the Althe to externalize their mourning into sonic sculpture. They showed the clans of Jurassic how to transform their ancestral armor into cathedrals of remembrance. The galaxy was reshaping. And humanity, born from ash and silence, now walked as its compass. But Arden Vance, even as a symbol, knew fragility better than most. So she returned. Not to battle, but to Earth. To the scarred world where it had begun. There, among the rebuilt towers of a city once called Sacramento, she stood barefoot on cracked ground, beneath the sky where her daughter's voice had first vanished into static. She placed a shard of the original resonance core into the earth. And spoke her final order. We do not conquer. We remind. That day, across 10,000 worlds, the resonance choirs sang a unified memory. Not of victory. Of persistence. The galaxy paused. For the first time in an age measured not in centuries but in extinctions, it paused. And it listened. Somewhere in that silence, an old species not yet named, watching from a system untouched by war, began to record their own losses. Elsewhere in the spectral dark of intergalactic space, a long-forgotten consciousness stirred, drawn by the density of memory, curious at last about the species who had made grief a weapon, then made that weapon into peace. And Earth, though still bearing its scars, no longer sat alone. It pulsed in the resonance web like a heart. Not the center of power, but the first world to weep without shame. And from that weeping, the stars changed. Humanity had been cut from the bone of extinction, shaped by loss, tempered in fire, and made whole not by forgetting, but by carrying. Not a spear, not a banner, but a blade of memory. And with it they had cleaved silence itself.